Hello dear students, today we are going to continue with lecture number 12 of Psycholinguistics. So today we are going to study the meaning and the scope of psycholinguistics. Now if you read the following poem and see how it describes the brain. So this poem was written by Emily Dixon. What she wrote is, the brain is wider than the sky, but put them side by side, the one the other will include. With ease and you beside, the brain is deeper than the sky. 4. Hold them blue to blue, the one the other will absorb. As sponges, buckets do. The brain is just the weight of God. For lift them, pound for them, per pound, and they will differ. If they do, as label from sound. Now what she wanted to try to say in this is that your brain is like a sponge. It will absorb as much information as possible. Whatever information you want to store in your brain will absorb it, and just like a sponge. And it's very, very deep, and it's wider than the sky, means that there is no limit to the memory that your brain can hold. Nobody knows how much. So in this poem, it's a very good description of how your brain works. And it's not about the size, but how much material the brain can store and how much memory. And all of that is connected to when you are collecting material in your day-by-day life, then you keep on storing that into your memory and in your brain. And then you use it to process language. So the meaning and scope of linguistics would be like language as a means of communication. Now if you see the diagram in the back, you can very clearly see that linguistics and psycholinguistics. Now linguistics is the basic field and psycholinguistics is a part of that field. The components in linguistics would be, and the process going through when you convert it into psycholinguistics. So language, message and information, that would be under the form of linguistics. Now in the process, the speaker who is encoding what you are saying and the listener who decodes. So the speaker is encoding, that means like they are transferring the material by speech to the listener who decodes it, who tries to translate it and understand it through the brain. So this is all a process that would contain the language, what the message is, and what information the speaker is trying to give to the listener. Then in linguistics, the object would be language, the structure components of a language. In psycholinguistics, the object would be speech process, language as a process. So you see the difference between both of them. The structural components of a language, how the language is structured, and language as a process, and how language is then processed. So psycholinguistics teaches us the speech process. Now the emergence of psycholinguistics. In 1952, the Social Science Research Council in the US, they went through an experiment, an interdisciplinary conference. Now 3 linguists and 3 psychologists. So they had a conference in which they called 3 linguists and 3 psychologists to discuss the emergence of psycholinguistics from the field of linguistics. In 1954, the publication of Charles E. Osgood and Thomas A. Seaborg, entitled Psycholinguistics, a survey of theory and research problems. So they gave a first publication at that time in the USA in 1954. It was written by Charles E. Osgood and Thomas A. Seaborg, and what they wrote was, and the title of that research, that the paper that they presented in the conference, was Psycholinguistics, a survey of theory and research problems. So when you were studying about it, it started so long ago. Then when you come to the definitions, now psychology of language learning, Now, it is a study of psychological and neurobiological factors that enables humans to acquire, use, and understand language. So we've gone through that many times. So it's a study that is based on your psychological and neurobiological factors, and it will help you, enable you to acquire, to get the language, to use the language, and to understand the language. Now, in other words, the studies done in psycholinguistics helps us to understand the psychology of how we learn and understand language, whether it is our first, second, or even third language. So what we are trying to do in psycholinguistics is learn that the studies that we are following under psycholinguistics, they would help us learn how we are, or help us understand really how the psychology works of how we learn something and how we would understand language. Now, it doesn't matter if that is your first language, your second language, or your third language. That means your first language would be your native language, second language would be the second language spoken in your country, and third language if you acquire a third different language. But either way, in any form, native or other language, you still have to understand the psychology of it, of how to use that language. So it's all about understanding the language and how your brain processes it. The study of mental processes involved in the comprehension, production, and acquisition of language. Now, this is basically all based on your mental processes. Now, it's involved comprehension, that means trying to understand it, production, trying to produce it, and acquisition of language, and how you acquire a language. Now, much psycholinguistic work has been devoted to the learning of language by children and on speech processing and comprehension by both children and adults. So most of the work that researchers have done in the field of psycholinguistics has been solely for how children learn the language and on how they process the speech, and the understanding of the language by children and by adults. So traditional areas of research include language production, language comprehension, language acquisition, language disorders, language and thought, and neurocognition. Encyclopedia Britannica, you can see neurocognition from there. Now, traditional areas. So when you are doing a research in the field of psycholinguistics, or the people who have conducted research, they included in that research language production, how language was produced, how the brain functions in producing the language. Then language comprehension, how we understand the language. Then language acquisition, how we acquire that language. Then language disorders. We've talked about a lot of disorders also, how people go through language disorders, and sometimes there are so many brain disorders that will affect your language also. So they will become language disorders then. Then language and thought, how you process the language through your thought, and neurocognition. So the study of psychological states and mental activity associated with the use of language. Now, an important focus of psycholinguistics is the largely unconscious application of grammatical rules that enable people to produce and comprehend intelligible sentences. So the main important focus, now when you see the studies of psychological states and how the mental activities are associated with the use of language, then you would say that an important focus would be that psycholinguistics is largely, it's focused on unconscious application of grammatical rules. Like we don't realize when we are unconsciously, we know where to apply the grammatical rules. We've learned the grammatical rules and then we just go ahead and automatically apply it. We don't have to think before we apply the grammatical rules. And that enables people to produce proper language which is comprehensible, which is understandable, and which has the proper syntax, proper structure. So by automatically using those grammatical rules, we are able to produce something that is intelligible, something that sentences that are easily understood. Now, psycholinguists investigate the relationship between language and thought. So psycholinguists, they basically, what do? They try to understand the relation between a language and thought, how a language works and how a thought can process that language. Now, a perennial subject of debate being whether language is a function of thinking or thought a function of the use of language. So, main subject would be that we would be debating would be that is language a function of thinking? Is it a part that is it a function that we have in processing when we are thinking, or thought a function of the use of language, or a thought is how to use a language? So, however, most problems in psycholinguistics are more concrete, involving the study of linguistic performance and language acquisition. So even though we are debating that whether the brain helps you produce the language, the thoughts help you produce the language, or you already have the language function in your brain and your thought will help you function that. So you need to differentiate between them. But even though the more concrete thing would be that the study of linguistic performance and language acquisition. So how linguistically you perform and how you acquire the language. So that would be the main point, especially in children. Now, the work of Noam Chomsky and other proponents of traditional transformational grammar have had a marked influence on the field. So you can see the Columbia Encyclopedia in 6th edition for reference to this. So Noam Chomsky, like I told you before, is a known linguist. The work of Noam Chomsky and other proponents of transformational grammar have had a marked influence on the field of psycholinguistics, or the acquisition of language. So the study of language processing, when we further move on, then it studies how word, sentence and discourse meaning are represented and computed in the mind. So first of all, what does it do? It studies how the words are processed, how you make a sentence, and discourse, discussion, meaning and the meanings of that discussion and the meaning of the discourse are represented and computed in the mind. Now it also studies how complex words and sentences are composed in speech and how they are broken down into their constituent parts during listening and reading. So not only does it study how the meaning is represented or computed in the mind, but also it would study more complex words, sentences that are composed in speech that are difficult, using difficult words, and how you would break them down into different parts to while you're listening or reading to try to understand it. So in short, it seeks to understand how language is done. The study of language behavior. Now, how real rather than ideal people learn and use language to communicate ideas. And what you want to see is in the language behavior is that how real or ideal would be for people to learn the language and then how to use it to communicate whatever thoughts they have in their mind or whatever ideas they want to communicate to the other person. So the study of the influence of psychological factors on the development, the use and interpretation of language. So you can check that out in the medical dictionary. I always like to give you references at the end of whatever I am stating, because then it makes it easy for you to, you can go and check those references, and maybe it'll make it more easy for you to understand the material on the slides. So the study of language behavior, how real it is, how people learn, and how they use language to communicate their ideas. The study of influence of psychological factors. Now, what psychological factors influence us in producing language, or on the development of language and the use of the language, and interpretation, how we understand the language, the meaning of the language. So subdisciplines within psycholinguistics. Now, if we go into the different disciplines of psycholinguistics, theoretical psycholinguistics would be one. So that would be a subfield of psycholinguistics. Language theories related to human mental processes in using language. So the first part would move on to theoretical psycholinguistics. That would study the language theory related to human mental processes, how the mind processes the language, in using language phonologically, in diction, in syntax, in discourse, and intonation arrangements. So phonologically, we've studied about the phonological view of how we change a language, then the diction, then the structure, syntax, then the discourse, and then the intonation arrangement, how the sounds would differ. The second would be developmental psycholinguistics. Now, theoretical linguistics, that deals with the mental process. Developmental psycholinguistics would deal with the process of language acquisition, both L1 and L2. L1 would be your native language, L2 would be a second language for you. So the process of how you acquire a language, that means how you learn a language. Either be it your native, if you're a child, how you start grasping a language and how you learn it from your parents, or if you are an adult and you are trying to learn a new language, like many of you would be in the process of learning many aspects of English language at the moment. So that would come under developmental psycholinguistics. Social linguistics. Social psycholinguistics. Now, social psycholinguistics is the third subdiscipline of psycholinguistics, and it covers the social aspects of language, that language is a string of thoughts and insights. So it will cover all the social aspects of the language and telling you that it's a sort of a line or a string containing your thoughts and your insights and whatever thoughts you have and whatever ideas you create. So that would be coming under social psycholinguistics. Then the next subfield for psycholinguistics would be educational psycholinguistics. Now, the educational aspects in formal education, the role of language in teaching of reading language proficiency. So in educational psycholinguistics, what would we cover? We would cover the aspects in your formal education, like from your schooling going up to your university. So that we would continue that in the role of language in teaching of reading, how the teachers or the professors would teach you to read a certain language, and language proficiency and how well you will perform in that language. The next subfield would be neuropsycholinguistics. Now, neuropsycholinguistics, the relation between language and the brain. What happens to language input and how output is programmed and formed inside the brain. So neuropsycholinguistics would focus just on what is the relation between a language and the brain and how the brain would process a language. So what happens when happens to language input and how output is programmed. So how do you gather language and store it in your brain, and how you take it, retrieve it from your memory, from your brain, and then have an output of it. And formed inside and how it's formed inside the brain, and how the process works of storing your memory and storing all the information that you get, and how you process a language. The next subfield would be experimental psycholinguistics. Now, in experimental psycholinguistics, the act and effect of using language. So the act and effect of using language, how you would use a language, and what effect that language would have. The next subfield would be applied psycholinguistics. Now, the application of all above subfields into other subjects. Applied psycholinguistics, it covers all of the other subfields that we've just discussed right now, and how all of those are applied, all of those subfields, how are they applied into other subjects. That would be applied psycholinguistics. So once that we have cleared the subfields of psycholinguistics, then we move on to the scope. Now, the scope, how language is acquired and produced by users. So how do users acquire the language, and then how do they produce it? Then how brain works on language, how the brain would work on language in the processing of it. Then language acquisition, how we would acquire the language. Then the difference between children's language acquisition and language learning. Then we want the scope would be that we would try to find out the difference between a child's way of acquiring the language acquisition, and language learning, and how a child would learn a language. Then linguistic interference, how linguistics would interfere in development of language. Then language development, how we would further develop that language, and the role of motivation in foreign language learning. And then what role of motivation does it play in a human being to learn a foreign language? What motivates us? So question psycholinguistics and their answers would be that mostly the questions that psycholinguistics would answer would be, what is the origin of language? Psycholinguistics would tell you what the origin of language is, how it is produced, so where the origin of language started, how it was produced, perceived, comprehended, and remembered. So all of these processes are taught under psycholinguistics of the production of language, how we perceive it, then how we understand, comprehend the language, and how we remember or store it in our memory. Then it also answers the questions of what is the origin of thought, how is thought created, and how is language represented in the mind, and how language represents itself in the mind. So what is the nature of language as a verbal behavior, verbally? What behavior do we use in the nature of language? Then how is language acquired? How is it used for different communicative processes? Now this is very important. How do we acquire the language, and then how do we use it? We use it through sign language, we use it through speech sounds, and different processes. So communicative processes, how do we use different language or different communicative purposes? How is language used for that? All of these questions are answered in the study of psycholinguistics. Further, psycholinguistics would answer also to what extent is language of biological growth? What growth? Biological growth, what extent is the language of biological growth? Then it would also answer what role does habit formation play in language acquisition. So how can we form habits, and how by forming a habit we can acquire a language. So imitation, we studied about that in children, language acquisition, children would imitate the parents or the adults, and they would sort of form a habit of the repetition of the words, and that's how they acquire language. So that also we can study in this. Then what is the essential relation between language and information? So studying the relation between language and information. All of these come under the field of psycholinguistics. Further on, also these languages are covered under the field of psycholinguistics. What is the communication structure of language? The structure of language is very important also. So is language purely a stimulus-response bond, or is it also creative behavior? So is it just a response that we naturally give as somebody asking us, and then we would have that process, a stimulus response, so we would immediately reply to it? Or is it a creative behavior, or do we create language also? So how does it go wrong? How can language acquiring go wrong? What role does creativity play in linguistic acquisition and production? Then the role of creativity, how creative a person can be in creating language, and how creative a person can be in acquiring a language and producing the language. So how do the learning conditions of L1 differ from those of L2? So the learning conditions, once again, how would it be different for learning your native language and then learning a new language? So what do you think, students, what do you think that, is there a difference in learning when a child is learning its native language and when a child or an adult is learning a second language? Are they the same, or the learning conditions are the same? So what kind of internalization process takes place when language is learned? So internally, what processes are taking place when you're learning a language? Then to what extent can the language acquisition process of children all over the world be held similar? And then to what extent, to what means can acquiring language, or the process of acquiring language of children, how children learn the language all over the world, how can it be held similar? Like in any country, in any language, how can we see that children learn their native language in similar ways? So we would move on to language, then language perception and production. Now in language perception and production, we would be discussing how you perceive the language, how you produce the language. Now that is affected by three things: behaviorism, rationalism, and pragmatism. So we will further go on to study these three parts: behaviorism, rationalism, and pragmatism. So first of all, let's take a theoretical background of Chomsky. Let's say that human language must be innate. Now according to Noam Chomsky, he stated that human language must be innate, available to us by virtue of being human, specified somehow in our genetic makeup. So somehow he says that it is built within a human mind. The language is built within a human mind, and it is just available to us because we are, by the virtue of being human, because we are humans, so we can acquire language. Then specified somehow in our genetic makeup, how genetically, like, we would inherit language from our parents. So innate, the properties available to all human languages, universal grammar. So innate properties would be that those universal grammar and that is available to every human being. Then it is the aspect of creativity that differs languages, the aspect of creativity, how language is created, that differs in languages. Then language is not produced by imitation only, but it is a creative behavior. So it's not, then his study continued on to say that language is not produced by imitation. So you can't just imitate something to learn a language. You need to be creative and you need to learn it. You need to learn the meaning of it also. Like if I would just repeat, let's say, any word in a different language, maybe I will learn that word, but I'll never know the meaning of that word. So to understand language, I will need to learn the meaning of that language also. And then how to form sentences, the structure to create language in a different language. So components of the mind, including language and other systems of knowledge, are largely innately determined. So components of the mind, the parts of your mind that include language learning also and other systems of knowledge, are largely innately determined. So they are largely determined on how your mind works to include language and store knowledge. Then experience interacts with innate properties to form competence. So your experience will interact with the innate properties, the built-in properties, to form competence in language. That means your ability to perform well. So we would further go on to move into epistemologies. Now, theories of nature of language and learning as a process of attaining such a knowledge. So it's the theories that we would study, that how naturally knowledge is acquired and how we would learn the process of attaining or getting such knowledge. So the first would be, the perspective would be in the empiricism perspective, and their epistemology would be behavioristic. That according to the empiricism, behavioristic would be that. The contributors are Locke and Thorndike. Then in rationalism, we would say that it's the cognitive epistemology is used. And the contributors for that are Descartes and Piaget. Then the perspective of pragmatism and socio-historicism, that would be situative, according to the situation. And the contributors to that would be Dewey, Mead, and Vygotsky. So now we further go on to study about behaviorism. The theory that human behavior is determined by conditioning rather than by thoughts or feelings, and that psychological disorders are best treated by altering behavioral patterns. So first of all, in behaviorism, this theory would say that human behavior is determined by conditioning rather than by thoughts and feelings. So we sort of determine a human's behavior by how we condition it, or how we form, or how we train them, instead of how their thoughts would work or how their feelings would work. And that psychological disorders are best treated by altering behavior patterns. And sometimes psychological disorders, they would be treated better by if we would alter or change the behavioral patterns. So an approach to psychology based on the proposition that behavior can be studied and explained scientifically without recourse to internal mental states. So an approach to psychology would be based on the proposition that behavior can be studied, we can study behavior, and explain scientifically, and then explain it scientifically without recourse to internal mental states. So it doesn't, we can explain it scientifically, that recourse to internal, without it, that the mental state doesn't matter. Then Skinner said that humans could construct linguistics stimuli that would then acquire control over their behavior in the same way that external stimuli could. So according to Skinner, humans can construct linguistic stimuli, and that would help them acquire or acquire the control, or get the control over their behavior in the same way that an external stimuli could take control of behavior. So organisms are seen as responding to conditions, stimuli set by the, now conditions are stimuli. So organisms are seen as responding to conditions set by the outer environment and inner biological processes. So the outer environment and the inner biological processes matter, and organisms can be seen responding to those stimuli. Then believes that behind every response lies a stimuli that elicits it. So behind every, and then that belief that whenever we give a response, and every response that we give, there is a stimuli behind it that would elicit it. For example, to feel pain, groan, writhe, moan. Those are the sounds that we make. You see, when we feel pain, so every response that we get from feeling pain, that would be either a groan, a writhe, or a moan, like, oh, I'm hurting, or oh, my head is hurting, or making those sounds. Those stimulus are elicited by the factor of the response to feel that we feel for pain. Then the desire for food, if we are feeling hungry, then eating and hunting would be the stimuli, the response for it. So if we feel hungry, we would either eat or we would go hunting for it. So intended as the logical doctrine to affect that the very meanings of the words refer to the mind. Intended as logical doctrine to the effect that if we see that every meaning of every word refers to your mind, its mental states and activities, and what mental state you are in, and what activity your brain is producing at that time, are to be analyzed in behavioral terms. So all of these things are analyzed in behavioral terms, and every mentalistic term is equal to behavioral term. So everything that goes in your mental state, which comes under your mentalistic term, would be related to your behavior term. For example, love, being unconscious, all of these. The mentalistic term would be love, and that would be according, and you would show it through your behavior. Then being unconscious, once again, you would show that. So next would be rationalism. Now in rationalism, the theory that reason is the foundation of certainty in knowledge. Now reason is the chief source and test of knowledge, innate ideas. So the theory of rationalism would say that it's the reason that is the foundation of certainty in knowledge, that it builds a foundation, a base in the certainty of the knowledge that we acquire. Then the second part would be the reason is the chief source and test of knowledge. Reason would be the chief source, the main way we gather knowledge, and then how we test the knowledge through our innate ideas. Then all language resemble each other in syntax. So why do they do that? Why do all languages resemble each other in syntax, in structure? A schema of universal grammar, deep structure or innate presettings. Innate presettings would, so a schema of universal grammar would be the reason why all the structures resemble each other, and deep structure of that, or innate presettings that move on to bases in the brain, set patterns for experience. Now fix the rules for the formation of meaningful sentences, readily translatable languages. So once we understand the meaning of a sentence, then we can translate it readily and immediately. So our brain is processing, it's the basis in our brain that is an innate presetting, which is set according to a pattern in which we experience how to fix the rules of grammar into understanding. Whenever we're hearing something like meaningful sentences, we immediately refer to the grammar, universal grammar that is stored in our memory to translate whatever the language is saying. For example, my beloved friend came to our house. So my beloved friend came to our house. That means that you are showing emotions also by saying that your beloved friend, some friend that you love a lot, came to visit your home. Now pragmatism. Pragmatism would be another part of it, a philosophy that evaluates assertions solely by their practical consequences and bearing on human interests. So pragmatism would be a philosophy that evaluates assertions solely by their practical consequences. So a philosophy that would judge, or evaluate means judging, the assertions solely by, or the points made solely by their practical consequences, whatever practical response you get, and bearing on human interests and whatever human interests are. So ideas are instruments and plans of action. So whatever ideas you have in your brain, they are a sort of instrument to produce a plan of action. You have an idea in your mind, you will go and take action on it. That would be how you use your ideas as instruments to plan the action that you're going to perform. So based on the principle that the usefulness, workability, and practicality of ideas, policies and proposals are the criteria of their merit. So based on this principle is the usefulness, how useful it is, workability, how you can work on it, and practicality, how practical these ideas are, and policies and proposals are the criteria of their merit. So possession of any kind of language is a mastery of body techniques. So if you have possession of any kind of language, you would be a master of a body of techniques. So it would contain lots of techniques to master a language. To look for the meaning of a term, one must look for its use. That is a quotation. Now, to look for the meaning of a term, that means like you need to know how to use a language to try to find the meaning of what it means. You can't just imitate and remember, let's say, a sentence and then, or a term, and then not even knowing the meaning. You can't understand it. Your brain can't process it. So to understand, to look at, find the meaning of any sort of term, you need to know how to use the language. For example, a broom. Now, a broom is a word, but you need to know what a broom does. A street vendor. Now, what is a street vendor? Do you know what a street vendor is? They are the people who are selling on the streets. We have many in Pakistan also. People who are selling hair clips, hair bands, they're selling fruit. They will go about on, they will have a stall on the road, or they will walk around carrying their merchandise. So that would be a street vendor. Somebody who's selling his material or his stuff or his goods on the street. Then how to use a broom, and then what a street vendor is. Now, if we don't know what a street vendor would be or what a broom is, how can we try to understand the meaning of it? Or how can we learn the language? So for learning these words, to learn this language, you need to know the meaning of it and how to use the meaning. So for a broom we know झाड़ू, okay. Street vendor, जो आपके लोग सड़क पे चीज़ें बेच रहे हैं, ठीक है, जो स्टॉल्स लगा के बेच रहे हैं, जो आपके पास गाड़ियों में आके आपको चीज़ें सेल कर रहे हैं, अपने गुड्स, अपने मटेरियल्स आपको दे रहे हैं. So now that you know the meaning of these two words, that means it will be easy for you to acquire this and store this in your memory. So language perception and production. So how you perceive language and how you produce it. First of all, human nature. Now, human nature would be to use language, and that would move on to human mind. Then human nature, going through other sources, also goes to your human mind. And all of this is connected from your human nature to your human mind through creativity. You create things. So acquiring language and other things is human nature, that and how your human mind would work to acquire a language. But the process of it is creativity, is creative. Then how human mind, it comprehends language production. How human mind would understand language production. That's the main. How a human mind would produce a language. Then how a human mind transforms its ideas into language perception. How to perceive language. It transforms the ideas into perceiving the language. Now language perception would create creativity and mental grammar. And that would combine into articulation. And then come back again to language production. So in a way your human mind is working to comprehend, at the same time to understand and create ideas, which would transfer into, like, by understanding you are producing language. So by creating ideas you are going through the process of language perception, then creativity, then mental grammar, you're using whatever grammar you have stored in your mind, then articulation, the sounds and how you produce the sounds, and how it goes back to producing language. So this is a whole process of the human mind. Now mental grammar. In psycholinguistics, mental grammar would be used. It's an abstract system of unconscious knowledge about language that includes knowledge about sentence structure, word order, meaning and sounds. Now this is something in psycholinguistics, when you're learning a language, your mental grammar, you have a part in your mind that is set for grammatical rules. So it's an abstract system that unconsciously you would learn with that knowledge. Unconsciously you would use that knowledge, and that knowledge would include sentence structure, how a sentence is formed, how the word order, how words are supposed to be placed inside a sentence, what are the meanings of those words, and how to produce the sounds. So bites the dog man. Now this is something, if we give you this, now a human being, when you process it through your mental grammar, you will know that the dog bites the man. See, you need to form these words, how you would form these words to make proper structure, to make it intelligible, to make it understood to the other person. Now, bites the dog man doesn't make sense, you see. Man bites the dog also doesn't make sense, because a man wouldn't bite a dog. But the dog bites man. A dog would bite a man. So that would make sense. So how we understand that is our mental grammar that is working in our brain. When we find, and we would reconstruct it. They live in a brown house. They live in a brown house. Once again, now that is very clear. Okay, they're telling us the color of the house. Okay, or and they live in a brown house. So that would be an example of how you would structure a sentence. Now, perception, how you would perceive it, the process whereby sensory stimulation is translated into organized experience. Now, perception is the process in which sensory stimulation would be translated into organized experience. How you would translate the sensory stimulation into organized experience. For example, now they've given you a different language here. Now, acupuncture, kunkain, mongshumo. You don't understand it because it's a language that you don't know, you see. Now, perceptual organization reflects innate properties of the brain. So, how you would organize a sentence reflects on the inbuilt qualities of your brain. So, when you see the sentence, you don't recognize it. So that means your brain doesn't recognize this language because you don't have this vocabulary stored in your brain. But if this same sentence would have been in Urdu or in English, then you could have understood it easily. So perception and brain functions are identical. So how we perceive language and the functions of the brain, they're identical in isomorphic way. To study perception means to study the brain. So to study perception would equal to studying the brain. The appearance of the object from a place where there is a brain, or in lower animals, some suitable nervous structure, with sense organs and nerves forming part of the intervening medium. So the appearance of the object, that would be in place, from a place where there is a brain. So the appearance of an object where our brain is situated. Or let's say in other animals, lower animals, they have a nervous structure also, suitable nervous structure, with sense organs, how we sense things, and nerves, how our nerves react, forming part of the intervening medium. So for example, the star, tree, rabbit. The star, how would we differentiate that? Tree, how would we know about that? Rabbit, that would be an animal. Now, a rabbit does have a suitable nervous structure, but rabbit doesn't have a complicated brain like humans. Tree, that would have nerve ends. That's how it becomes live. A star, no idea. So that's how you would see that your brain would perceive things in a different way from animals. So language production. Now language production, imagine the situation of the following dialogues. So what I would like you to do is, when producing language, we want to go through an experiment right now. Imagine the situation of the following dialogues. So while we are reading these sentences, I would like you to imagine also the situation in which these dialogues are being said. First dialogue would be, where's my briefcase? There's your briefcase. So what you're doing is that one person is asking, where is my briefcase? And the other person is answering, there's your briefcase. That means he's pointing towards the briefcase and saying, there it is. Now person B points to the briefcase the same moment he says, theirs. So in this, what you want to perceive it is, when I am asking where is my briefcase, you are going to tell me, there is your briefcase. That means you are pointing towards the briefcase if it's sitting at the end of the room. So the person, you would, right when you're saying theirs, at that same moment you would be pointing towards that. That would be a way of producing language. Second dialogue would be, where is my coat and briefcase? Now they're asking for two things. Where is my coat and briefcase? There's your briefcase. Person B points to the briefcase the same moment he says briefcase. So in this, he's been asked two questions. Where is my coat and where is my briefcase? So he wouldn't point when he's saying theirs. He would say, there's your briefcase. That means your coat, I don't know where it is, but your briefcase is lying there. So the model for speech production produced by Levitt was conceptualization, formalization, articulation, and self-monitoring. So four things that we would study in the production of speech would be conceptualization, how we conceptualize a language, formulation, how we formulate a language, articulation, what articulation do we use, how do we articulate language, and self-monitoring, and how do we self-monitor ourselves. So conceptualization, when we study that, now linguistic concepts are formed as two concurrent and parallel modes of thought. So when in conceptualization, when we're studying that, there are two different concurrent concepts formed in linguistics that are parallel modes of thought, that are going side by side. One is syntactic thinking and the other is imagistic thinking. So syntactic thinking would be segmented and linear, creates the strings of syllable, word, phrase, and sentence. So syntactic would be how we structure, how our thoughts would structure a language, how we would segment it, and the linear and segmented and linear way of producing language, and then how creating the strings of syllables of words and forming it into or putting together phrases to make a sentence. Imagistic thinking would be global and syntactic, tends to develop gestures to punctuate and illustrate conversation. So imagistic thinking would cover the global and syntactic views of it, and it tends to develop gestures to punctuate and illustrate conversation. So it would help us developing gestures, maybe to punctuate a sentence, how we take a pause, or to illustrate a language. Formulation. Now, formulation would think about this sentence. In formulation, I'll give you an example. Rapid writing with his uninjured hand saved him from losing the contents of the capsized canoe. Rapid writing with his uninjured hand saved him from losing the contents of the capsized canoe. What does this mean? You want to think about this, how he formulated the sentence. A canoe is a boat, so he had contents or stuff of his own stuff in the canoe, in the boat. Rapid writing, that means like suddenly he made it right with his uninjured hand. So that means one of his hand was injured, one hand was not injured. So with his uninjured hand, he rapidly, very fast or very quickly, he righted the boat. Like that means he turned it around. Capsized means when a boat turns over or boat goes underwater. That would be capsizing a canoe. So instead of losing the contents when his boat was going to flip over or turn, he rapidly saved the boat from turning over and saved his contents from it by writing it the boat with his uninjured hand. So what he did is, उसने अपने जो उसका हाथ, एक हाथ उसका जख्मी था, एक हाथ उसका जख्मी नहीं था, उससे उसने उस बोट को उलटने से बचा लिया. ठीक है, उसने क्विक एक्शन किया और उसको सीधा कर दिया बोट को, ताकि उसके जो कंटेंट्स थे बोट के अंदर, जो चीजें थे, सामान था, वो लूज ना हो जाए. So slips of the tongue, spoonerism. आपके जुबान से स्लिप हो जाते हैं वर्ड्स, जिसको हम स्पूनरिज्म भी बोलेंगे. An actual word or phrase is created often with a humorous twist to the meaning which was intended. So sometimes हमारे जुबान से हम बोलना कुछ चाह रहे होते हैं, निकल कुछ और जाता है. For example, an actual word or phrase जो है ना create हो जाता है, ठीक है, एक funny way में, ठीक है, उसमें एक humorous twist आ जाता है, जो meaning हम लोगों ने नहीं वो करना. The best in bread, that means अगर हमने कहना the best in bread, the breast in bed. So breast piece in bed, chicken का जो है आप वो चीज़ देख लें बेड में, अगर आप वो उसको एक्सप्लेन कर रहे हो, और द बेस्ट इन ब्रेड, और या ब्रेड में आपका बेस्ट जो है क्वालिटी. सो जस्ट बाय स्लिपिंग द टंग यू चेंज द कॉन्टेक्स्ट ऑफ द मीनिंग. So what is relevant to psycholinguistics is not what is being said, but how it is being said or misspoken. So सबसे ज़्यादा important psycholinguistics में क्या चीज़ है, वो नहीं कि क्या कहा जा रहा है, but कैसे कहा जा रहा है और कैसे उसको अगर गलत मिसइंटरप्रेट किया जाता है. So further examples of that would be a reading list. That would be a leading list. Because say a reading list, हमारे मुंह से एकदम leading list निकल जाएगा. Big and fat, pig and fat. Big की जगह pig निकल गया. Fill the pool, fill the fool. Drop a bomb, bop a drop. Sesame seed crackers, Sesame Street crackers. ठीक है, ये ऐसे एग्जाम्पल्स हैं कि फॉर्मुलेशन ऑफ सेंटेंस चेंज होती है. आपको टंग ट्विस्टर्स आप यूज़ करते हैं, बहुत दफ़ा आप लोग ऐसे, यानी हम लोग बचपन में भी वी यूज्ड टू यूज़ सच टंग ट्विस्टर्स विद आवर फ्रेंड्स, टेलिंग हम कि आप इस चीज़ को बार बार रिपीट करो. सो व्हेन यू आर रिपीटिंग समथिंग दैट इज़ सॉर्ट ऑफ राइमिंग, आप गलत बोलते हैं. आप उसको किसी को जंबल अप करने के लिए यू ट्राई टू मेक हिम से दैट वर्ड अगेन एंड अगेन, एंड दे वुड मिस स्पेल दैट वर्ड और mispronounce that word. So these are examples of that. A reading list, a leading list. बार बार अगर मैं आपको कहूँ ना रीडिंग लिस्ट, रीडिंग लिस्ट, रीडिंग लिस्ट, बार बार रिपीट करूँ तो रीडिंग लिस्ट बीच में निकल आएगा. बिग एंड फैट, 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 एकदम से मुंह से ये निकल गया. ठीक है, सेसमी सीड क्रैकर्स, सेसमी स्ट्रीट क्रैकर्स. ठीक है, you can't say these words. So what I would like you to do, it's a funny experiment, you can do that also. Take these 5 words and try to repeat them again and again and see where you slip and make similar sounds to it. So articulation then. The electrical impulses streaming from the brain in the form of speech are transformed into audible and comprehensible production. So articulation में क्या चीज़ होती है? The electrical impulses that are streaming from the brain, आपके brain से electrical impulses आ रही हैं, ठीक है, nerves पे, in the form of speech, speech की form में, and are transformed into audible and comprehensible production. ऐसी चीज़ जो sound create कर रही हो, audible भी हो, and understandable production में आप उसको electrical impulses को जो speech की सूरत में आपके brain से transfer होते हैं. Analogy in orchestra, conceptualization, formalization, articulation. So analogy in orchestra, that would be how you conceptualize it, how you would formulate it, and how you would articulate it. Then self-monitoring, that was the last one also. Now self-monitoring, how you would self-monitor yourself to create something. Now examples, the last I know about it. That means like I knew about it. He had left Vancouver. So last I knowed about it. Self monitoring आप कैसे करते हो? आप खुद अपने आप को correct करते हो. ठीक है, जब आप कहते हो कि आपने अब गलत बोल दिया sentence, let's say the last I knowed about it, he had left Vancouver. So that's grammatically wrong. That's when you correct yourself and you say the last I knowed about it, I knew about it, and he left Vancouver. ये आपने अपने बीच में जब when you said I knew, that means you're self-monitoring yourself. She was so drunk that we decided to drive her home. She was, drunk. She was so drunk that we decided to drive her home. I think it costs just about $25. So I think it costs just about, फिर का जो हम ब्रेक लिया हमने $25. So these are all things of examples of how you would monitor yourself and how you would try to correct your sentences. Like this is a process that goes within your brain that automatically, naturally it happens. It's not something that you would keep on doing, but it's or you would have to create and do. It's something that would just naturally, it's a natural act that would naturally just happen. That you are suddenly saying something wrong and then you realize, oh, I said that wrong. Even when you're typing a message, sometimes you send the wrong spelling for a message, and then you would immediately send it again with the proper correct spellings. So that is self-monitoring. When you're monitoring your own language and correcting yourself, when you know where you've made a mistake. So human beings are built to make mistakes. Everybody makes a mistake. So in speech also we can make mistake. In written language we can make mistake. So it's just all about how you would monitor yourself in fixing those mistakes. So self-monitoring is how you judge yourself in correcting a language and how you would follow to connect a language by correcting it by knowing what your fault was and then immediately accepting it and correcting it. So that would be how you would be self-monitoring yourself. So not only that you're not depending on people to correct your language, but you're depending on yourself also to correct that language. So automatically it happens naturally when you do have a knowledge of a language. Then if you do make mistakes, you would automatically, just your brain would automatically correct that. You would immediately know, I made a mistake here. I need to say this word in a different way. And that's how you would self-monitor yourself. So students, that is enough for today. We will continue studying about psycholinguistics in our further lectures also. What I want to say is now in today's lecture you needed to see how well you understood all this, how the brain is processing to produce language. What are the different factors that are involved in it, and what are those different factors and how do they affect the production of language? And how do you change your thoughts and create them using ideas and create it into language production? So go over these slides and please try to understand the examples. Once again, go over the examples by repeating them again and again. Maybe you can create something for the self-monitoring. You can create sentences similar that you think you could jumble up. And do that exercise at home just as a self-monitoring exercise to see where you make mistakes. So students, thank you so much for today, and we will continue in the next lecture. Good day.